So we are reading in a very difficult part of the poem.
On est toujours dans la descente de la nuit. Descente in the night.
We finished the descent into the night. I'm going to read the last sentence of the previous canto on page 219. He's having this terrible experience, truly terrible experience. But he endured, stilled the vain terror, bore the smothering coils of agony and affright. Then peace returned, and the soul's sovereign gaze. To the blank horror, a calm light replied. Immutable, undying and unborn, mighty and mute, the Godhead in him woke and faced the pain and danger of the world. He mastered the tides of nature with a look. He met with his bare spirit naked hell. As you go out, you can have a look at the mother's sketch. She has done a sketch of King Aswapati at this moment. And then there's Huta's painting of King Aswapati mustering all his inner strength to face naked hell. And he has to go on facing it. And we have to go on facing it with him for the next canto, since we've decided that we would read all the whole poem. We wouldn't leave anything out. The world of falsehood, the mother of evil, and the sons of darkness. Then could he see the hidden heart of night, the labor of its stark unconsciousness revealed the endless, terrible, inane. A spiritless blank infinity was there, a nature that denied the eternal truth in the vain braggart freedom of its thought, hoped to abolish God and reign alone. There was no sovereign guest, no witness light. Unhelped, it would create its own bleak world. Its large, blind eyes looked out on demon acts. Its deaf ears heard the untruth its dumb lips spoke. Its huge, misguided fancy took vast shapes. Its mindless sentience quivered with fierce conceits, engendering a brute principle of life, evil and pain begot a monstrous soul. The anarchs of the formless depths arose, great Titan beings and demoniac powers, world egos racked with lust and thought and will, vast minds and lives without a spirit within, impatient architects of error's house, leaders of the cosmic ignorance and unrest, and sponsors of sorrow and mortality, embodied the dark ideas of the abyss. A shadow substance into emptiness came. Dim forms were born in the unthinking void, and eddies met and made an adverse space in whose black folds being imagined hell. His eyes, piercing the triple-plated gloom, identified their sight with its blind stare. Accustomed to the unnatural dark, they saw unreality made real and conscious night. A violent, fierce, and formidable world. An ancient womb of huge calamitous dreams, coiled like a larva in the obscurity that keeps it from the spear points of heaven's stars. It was the gate of a false infinite, an eternity of disastrous absolutes, an immense negation of spiritual things. All once self-luminous in the spirit sphere turned now into their own dark contraries. Being collapsed into a pointless void that yet was a zero parent of the worlds. Inconscience, swallowing up the cosmic mind, produced a universe from its lethal sleep. Bliss, into black coma fallen, insensible, coiled back to itself and God's eternal joy, through a false, poignant figure of grief and pain, still dolorously nailed upon a cross, fixed in the soil of a dumb, insentient world, where birth was a pang and death an agony, lest all too soon should change again to bliss. So this is not a short canto. We have to go through it. We have to have the same courage and endurance and go through what is written here. Will you begin, Prema?
Then could he see the hidden art of life, the level of its thought unconsciousness, revealed the endless terrible name. A spiritless blank infinity was there, a nature that denied the eternal truth. In the vain, broad-bred freedom of its thought, hope to abolish God and dream alone. There was no sovereign guest, no witness, unhelped it would create its own bleak world.
Thank you. So this is Asvapati, and with this great spiritual courage, he is able to, unprotected, meet all the horrors of hell. And he can see into the hidden heart of this night of falsehood. He can see into the very core of it. Something is at work there. The labor of its stark unconsciousness. It's just the very opposite of consciousness and light is working there. And it's revealing, it's showing the endless, terrible, inane, the meaninglessness. A universe of meaninglessness. There's an infinity there, but this is not the divine infinity, but a spiritless, blank infinity was there. And there's a nature that's denying, that's saying no to the eternal truth. Just opposing it, saying, no, it is not true. That nature is, it says, a braggart. Somebody who brags, he's telling how good he is, how strong and powerful he is. This vain, braggart freedom of its thought hoped to abolish God, to wipe God out, reign alone by itself, that nature that denied the eternal truth. That nature says that there's nothing like the sovereign guest, the divine part within us. There's nothing like the witness light of our souls. It doesn't need anything like that. Unhelped, that nature wants to create its own bleak world. Bleak, there's no beauty in it, there's no happiness in it, there's no warmth in it. It's blank and empty and terrible. And this nature, it has eyes. That's what comes next. Will you read? Line 10.
Eyes looked out on demon eyes. Its deep ears heard the untruth its dark lips spoke. It's a heart
Huge.
misguided fancy took vast shape. Its mindless
Sentience.
sentience, purely with fierce fierce conceit,
Yes.
engendering a
Brute.
brute principle of life. Evil and pain begot a monstrous soul.
Thank you. So that nature, it has eyes. They're even large eyes, but they are blind. But still, somehow they're looking out and seeing dreadful actions, demon, evil actions. That nature has ears, but those ears are deaf. What they hear is just the untruth, the lies, the falsehood that it's speaking with its own dumb lips. This nature has a fancy, a way of choosing and thinking. That fancy, that fantasy takes vast shapes. It has some sentience, some capacity to sense things, but it's mindless. There's no mind at work putting these sense impressions together, but they are somehow quivering with fierce, violent conceits, imaginations. Evil and pain together are giving birth to a monstrous soul. They are engendering, creating together a brute principle of life. Evil and pain together are giving birth to this monstrous soul. You want to read? Line 16. She does. Okay, you'll read 10.
Evil and pain. So the annals of the four steps arose. Great titan beings and demonic powers. World egos wrecked his lust and thought and will. Vast minds and lives without the spirit within. Impatient architects of error's house, leaders of the cosmic ignorance and unrest, and sponsors of sorrow and mortality, embody the dark ideas of the abyss.
Thank you. Anarchs. Anarchy is no rule. These anarchs are in a way ruling, but they're ruling in the opposite way. They're coming up out of the formless depths. They are great Titan beings, tremendously powerful and yet evil, demoniac powers. They are huge egos, world egos, and they are suffering themselves, they are suffering, they are racked, tortured with lust and thought and will. There are vast minds and lives, but without any divine spirit within. They are eager to create something. They build error's house, the house of falsehood. They are the leaders of the universal ignorance and unrest, the opposite of peace. They're sponsoring, they're supporting and spreading sorrow and mortality, sadness and grief and death. So these anarchs, these leaders, they are embodying, they're taking forms, embodying the dark ideas of the abyss. The abyss, the deep, dark hole at the bottom of things. Kamla, would you read?
A shadow, substance, and emptiness came. Dim forms were born in the unthinking void, and eddies met and made an adverse space, in whose black folds being imagined held. His eyes piercing the triple-plated gloom, identified their sight with his blind stare. Accustomed to the unnatural dark, they saw, and reality made real and conscious night, a violent, fierce, and formidable world, an ancient womb of huge, calamitous dreams, coiled like a larva in the obscurity that keeps it from the spear points of heaven's stars. It was the gate of a false infinite, an eternity of disastrous absolutes, an immense negation of spiritual things.
Thank you. We could wonder how all these things could come into existence at all. You know? It's a kind of opposite of existence, but still a shadow substance. It's not solid like matter, but a shadow substance comes into that emptiness, and dim, shadowy forms were born in that emptiness, the void, the unthinking void. Eddies usually happen in water, where water is flowing and turning, but it can happen also with mist. Perhaps these are eddies of mist, of darkness, flowing together and creating an adverse space, a space that's full of hostility and ill will. And somehow in these eddies, this adverse space, being, the power of being, imagined hell, absolute evil and suffering. If we think about this, or if we try to think about the supreme truth and the way things really are, the rishis and teachers have told us that there are these three ultimate principles: Sat, Chit, Ananda. Sat, existence; Chit, consciousness; Ananda, bliss. But here, these things are The being, the Sat, somehow in this darkness, it's imagining hell, this terrible, dark existence of suffering and painfulness. So in that darkness, Asvapati's eyes, he has this amazing power of vision. It's not vision like our eyes have, it's an inner vision. His eyes can pierce through, they can drill through that gloom, that darkness. And the poet says it is triple-plated. If something is triple-plated, it's very, very carefully, many times coated to make it strong. So he can pierce through that triple-plated gloom, and he can identify his sight with the blind stare of that atmosphere. They get used, Asvapati's eyes get accustomed to that unnatural dark. And he can see, his eyes can see unreality made real and conscious night. Night in the sense of darkness and falsehood. So what he sees is a world that is violent, fierce, formidable, terrifying. It seems to have existed for a long time. It's an ancient womb out of which huge, calamitous dreams are constantly being born. That womb is coiled up like a larva in the obscurity, in the darkness, that prevents the spear points of heaven's stars from reaching it. There's this beautiful idea that the rays of light we receive from the stars, they are like weapons of truth. No? The stars represent the many truths, and their rays are like spear points. But those spear points of truth, they can't reach that thing like a larva which is coiled up there in the darkness and producing all these terrible dreams, these nightmares, these huge, calamitous dreams. That world was the gate, the entry of a false infinite. An infinity of falsehood. An eternity of disastrous absolutes. An immense negation of spiritual things. It is huge, infinite, eternal, immense, but it's a negation. It is saying no. It is refusing everything that is true, that has spiritual light, an immense negation of spiritual things. It even has the power to turn spiritual things into their opposites. And that's what we read next. Lila.
All once self-luminous in the spirit sphere turn now into their own dark countries, being collapsed into a pointless void that yet was a zero parent of the worlds, in conscious, swallowing up the cosmic mind, produced a universe from its little sleep. Bliss into black karma fallen, insensible, coiled back to itself and God's eternal joy, through a false poignant figure of grief and pain, still dolorously nailed upon a cross, fixed in the soil of a dumb, insentient world, where birth was a pang and death an agony, lest all too soon should change in again to bliss.
Yes. So again we have these three states: being, consciousness, bliss. All these things, once self-luminous, full of their own light, turned now, it's as if they're turned inside out into their own dark contraries, their own opposites. So being, existence, just collapses into a meaningless emptiness. And yet that meaningless emptiness is giving birth to worlds. It's a zero and nothingness which is giving birth to the worlds. An asat, perhaps we can say, a non-existence. Then consciousness becomes inconscience, just swallows up the universal mind and produces a universe of its own from its lethal sleep. It's sleep that brings about death. And bliss, Ananda, has fallen into a coma. It's become completely unaware of itself. Black coma, insensible. It can't feel anything. It's coiling back to itself. Perhaps it will return back to its true self and to God's eternal joy. But it's doing so through this false, poignant, such a painful sight of this figure. It's like the figure of Christ painfully nailed upon a cross, and that cross is fixed in the soil of a world without feeling, a dumb, insentient world. But even though there's no feeling, still birth, coming into existence, was painful, a pang, a pain, and death, and agony. And this is happening as if to prevent everything to turn back to its true origin, to bliss. It doesn't want to allow that to happen. It would be happening too soon. Lest means so that something should not happen. So all this is happening to delay the moment when everything changes back to its true state of bliss. Ganga Lakshmi, would you read?
Don't suck priestess of Pembesiki on her black figure of the true triune snake. Reading by opposite signs the eternal script. The sorceress reversing lives God flame. In darkling
Isles.
with evil eyes for lamps, a fatal voice chanting from the Alps, in strange infernal dim basilica, and turning the magic of the unholy word. The ominous profound initiate performs the ritual of her mystery. Their suffering was nature daily, alluring to the anguish
Heart.
a heart and flesh, and torture was a formula of delight. Pain mimicked the celestial ecstasy.
Yes. So he's saying that everything that is spiritual turns to its opposite, no? So one of the things that also turns, not only being, consciousness, bliss, but then he moves on to thought. Thought also should give light, no? Consciousness. But thought here is sitting like a priestess. We have had this picture several times in the poem of the initiate, the priestess who can give messages from the highest consciousness. And in the image of the old Greek oracle in Delphi, there in the temple of Apollo, the god of sun and music and light, there was a place and a priestess. He's shown us this priestess in different ways so many times in the poem. But in order to give her divine messages, she used to sit on a special seat with 3 legs, a tripod. So here, this priestess, this figure who can communicate the truth, is instead turned, she's become a priestess of perversity, where everything's twisted and made false. And there she's sitting on her black tripod, her 3-legged stool, which is supported by a triune snake, a 3-fold snake. A snake is always a symbol of energy, in this case of hostile energies. And she's reading by opposite signs the eternal script. Instead of giving the message as it should come from the gods, she's just reading it back to front or inside out in the opposite way. She's a sorceress. She's doing black magic, and she's reversing, she's turning inside out the divine frame of life. And then he seems to describe a kind of temple. In a large sacred building, there will be aisles, pathways, where we can pass from the entrance up through the temple towards the end. Those are called aisles. These aisles, he says, they have evil eyes for lamps. There are lamps along the aisles lighting the way, but they are evil eyes. And instead of beautiful sacred singing, there are fatal voices chanting from the apse. That's a part of the temple. And these strange infernal has to do with the lower depths depths with hell. These dim basilicas. A basilica is a church or a temple. Where here there's no light or very little light. This sorceress, she's not a priestess, she's a sorceress. She's chanting, intoning the magic of the unholy word, just the opposite of what it should be. She, that priestess of thought, she's ominous, something threatening, dangerous about her. She's performing the ritual of her mysteries, her occult rituals. This is one of the powers which is turned into its opposite. Suresh.
Faithless gardener of water.
Where are you? I'm sorry. It's at line 62.
No, it's after 65.
Pain.
Pain limit, the celestial external. But you have 4 lines. 1, 2, 3.
Yes, I think I stopped at line 61. So can you read from line 62?
Their suffering was nature's daily food, alluring to the
Anguished.
heart and flesh, and
Torture.
torture was the formula of life. Pain limit the celestial ecstasy.
Yes, so this is the aspect of suffering, no? That it even says it's attractive, alluring to the heart and the flesh, even though they're feeling so much pain. Torture, when we cause terrible pain to people, this was the formula of delight. Pain is copying, mimicking the divine bliss. Then please go on from there, Suresh. There, good. Yeah?
Good, faithless gardener of water lead to the world's
Upas.
tree, and careful of the outward word and act.
Engrafted is hypocrite.
Hypocrite rules on native will. All ideals serve the nature opposite. The form of God sustain the demon cult. Heaven space become a mosque and snare of hate. Wherein the heart of living beyond in the renounce action.
Rhythm.
Freedom for he saw the shape
Illimitable.
illimitable and
Vague.
sitting on death who swallows all things born. A chill fixed facing death and motionless eyes. That dreadful
Trident.
in a shadowy and outstretched she
Pierced.
pleased all
Creatures. All creatures.
all creatures with one faith.
Yes. So good is another thing that gets turned around to its opposite. Good should be watering the gardens of the gods. But he says it's a faithless gardener. He's not doing good, he's doing the opposite. He's showing off that he's virtuous, that he's doing the right thing. But he's watering with his virtue the world's upas tree. I don't know whether this upas tree really exists anywhere in the world, but it's supposed to be a tree that destroys everything around it, poisons the ground all around it. So a hypocrite is somebody who pretends to be what he is not, who pretends to be virtuous and who does wrong things. He may be very careful about the outward word and act, but all the time he's engrafting his hypocrite blooms on native ill. If you look after roses or mango trees, you have to do grafting. You have to be able to cut a shoot off one place and to put it in so that it will grow in another part of the tree. So here he's making things that are already wrong even worse. So in this state, all high things, all the things that we value, are just serving their nether opposites. They're opposites on the lower levels. The forms of gods sustained a demon cult, worship of devils. Heaven's face itself becomes a mask, a snare, a trap to carry people to hell. And there, in this world, Asvapati sees, in the very heart of all these vain phenomena, these misleading, meaningless appearances, he sees in the very heart, in the core of some enormous action that's going on, that is writhen, twisted. He saw a shape, a form, huge, illimitable, vague. This shape is sitting on death, who swallows all things born. This shape has a face, a chill, cold, fixed face, with dire, terrifying eyes that don't move. This shape is a female shape. He says, she has a trident, her dreadful trident in her shadowy hand outstretched. She is piercing all creatures with one fate, the fate of suffering and death. So if we go back to page 220, we'll see that Asvapati is exploring now the world of falsehood, and there he sees the mother of evil, and then later on the sons of darkness. So I think this description here from line 75, this is an adverse figure. It's like a shape of Durga, but it's been reversed to have a very ominous meaning. He sees this shape like a great goddess, but vague. We can't see her properly. She's so vast also. Instead of sitting on a triumphant lion or tiger, she's sitting on death. Death who swallows all things born. Her face is cold, fixed. Her eyes are dire, they don't move, they're terrifying. In her hand, she has her trident, her three-pronged weapon. She holds it in her shadowy hand. She pierces all creatures, everything that exists, with one fate, the fate of suffering and death.
Shraddhavan, go ahead, let's use.
Yes, Rani.
So sitting on death in this case is not so much conquering it as riding it.
Riding it, yes. Riding it, yes. That's her vehicle, the one who supports her. Like Ganesh has his mouse and Kartikeyan has his peacock, and Durga usually has a lion. Yeah. So there's this figure of death.
Shraddhavan, when you tell Durga, maybe this is opposite to Durga.
Yes, this
But
is...
it's not the Gorgon?
No, no.
It's not the tree Gorgon?
I don't think so, no.
No.
No, I think this is, as you exactly said, a totally distorted, falsified image of Durga, and it's the mother of evil. Just in these few lines, that's what's described here. So we'll stop there for today. I think in the next section, Sri Aurobindo will describe to us how this terrible state of things could come about. How could it come into existence? I think that's coming in the next section. Thanks to Sri Aurobindo. Then could he see the hidden heart of night, the labour of its stark unconsciousness revealed the endless, terrible, inane. A spiritless, blank infinity was there. A nature that denied the eternal truth in the vain braggart freedom of its thought, hoped to abolish God and reign alone. There was no sovereign guest, no witness light. Unhelped, it would create its own bleak world. Its large blind eyes looked out on demon acts. Its deaf ears heard the untruth its dumb lips spoke. Its huge, misguided fancy took vast shapes. Its mindless sentience quivered with fierce conceits, engendering a brute principle of life. Evil and pain begot a monstrous soul. The anarchs of the formless depths arose, great Titan beings and demoniac powers, world egos racked with lust and thought and will, vast minds and lives without a spirit within. Impatient architects of error's house, leaders of the cosmic ignorance and unrest, and sponsors of sorrow and mortality, embodied the dark ideas of the abyss. A shadow substance into emptiness came. Dim forms were born in the unthinking void, and eddies met and made an adverse space, in whose black folds being imagined hell. His eyes, piercing the triple-plated gloom, identified their sight with its blind stare. Accustomed to the unnatural dark, they saw unreality made real and conscious night. A violent, fierce, and formidable world, an ancient womb of huge calamitous dreams, coiled like a larva in the obscurity that keeps it from the spear points of heaven's stars. It was the gate of a false infinite, an eternity of disastrous absolutes, an immense negation of spiritual things. All once self-luminous in the spirit's sphere, turned now into their own dark contraries. Being collapsed into a pointless void that yet was a zero parent of the worlds. In conscience, swallowing up the cosmic mind, produced a universe from its lethal sleep. Bliss into black coma fallen, insensible, coiled back to itself, and God's eternal joy through a false, poignant figure of grief and pain, still dolorously nailed upon a cross, fixed in the soil of a dumb, insentient world where birth was a pang and death an agony, lest all too soon should change again to bliss. Thought sat, a priestess of perversity, on her black tripod of the triune snake, reading by opposite signs the eternal script, a sorceress reversing life's God frame. In darkling aisles, with evil eyes for lamps, and fatal voices chanting from the apse, in strange, infernal, dim basilicas, intoning the magic of the unholy word, the ominous, profound initiate performed the ritual of her mysteries. There, suffering was nature's daily food, alluring to the anguished heart and flesh, and torture was the formula of delight. Pain mimicked the celestial ecstasy. There, good, a faithless gardener of God, watered with virtue the world's upas tree, and careful of the outward word and act, engrafted his hypocrite blooms on native ill. All high things served their nether opposite. The forms of gods sustained a demon cult. Heaven's face became a mask and snare of hell. There, in the heart of vain phenomenon, in an enormous action's writhen core, he saw a shape illimitable and vague, sitting on death, who swallows all things born. A chill fixed face, with dire and motionless eyes, her dreadful trident in her shadowy hand outstretched, she pierced all creatures with one fate.